everybody. Well, you can tell we're the last show, or the last panel before the end. I'm hoping we're going to get some more folks in, but we're talking permitting today. My name is Chris Shipley. I'm the Executive Director of Public Policy at INCOMPAS. You are at Modernizing Network Infrastructure Permitting, Federal Policy Shifts in the Road Ahead. Now, when we were getting ready for this event, we thought, what would the walk-up music be for each of these panels? And we've been successful, less successful, depending on how this has gone. However, I chose Edwin Starr's 25 Miles. Now, that is a propulsive and exciting song about the anticipation of reaching the end of your journey. In Edwin's case, it was because he was trying to get home to someone special. But I do think it applies here because there's this great countdown about being 25 miles, 15 miles, 10 miles, and then he counts from 10 all the way down to 1. And I thought, you know what? It's exciting, and the anticipation of finishing a broadband deployment and getting to the end of that deployment is just as exciting for all of you builders as it is for Edwin Starr to get home to his loved ones there, probably I think in Chicago, if I remember exactly where Edwin Starr is from. So that's why we walked up to that one. This is permitting is such an important part, I think, of what you all do. Smart permitting, can unlock investment. It accelerates innovation. It delivers the networks that power our economy and our communities. I think the problem is that if we were to look at the state of permitting right now, and it was Edwin Starr's 25 miles, it would get chopped and screwed and slowed down, and it would sort of drag a little bit, because I think what we've seen here is that there are challenges to broadband deployment that many of you have that are common, I think, across the country. And if we could go to the first Slido question, I would be very curious to sort of know what you all think of as being the biggest obstacle you currently face when deploying broadband infrastructure. We've got a couple of options I think that we're going to talk about and highlight and get into a little more detail today. Delays, environmental and historical review, fees, and in-kind compensation requests. All of these are the different barriers that are being put up, I think, to fiber and telecommunications providers as you are looking to deploy your networks. All right. Delays, great. Oh, Jay, you're going to be busy today, I think, talking a little bit about environmental and or historical review. Okay, so before I get to our distinguished panel today, as you all continue to answer that question, I want a couple of examples of each of these. And you don't have to name names. You don't have to talk about the specific jurisdiction that's giving you a hard time. But I know that there are numerous examples of how delays, fees, environmental and historical review have been barriers to your deployment. So let's talk about it. Who wants to give an example of, just a short example of one of these items? There we go, Alan. This is how we're going to frame our discussion today.
Sure. I mean, we have a major metropolitan city that has one individual who is responsible for reviewing permit applications, and you either have to really bother him or just have good luck for him to respond. I mean, that's it. I mean, it's a choke point.
When you say major metropolitan, I mean, what are we talking about in terms of a population?
Oh, I mean, it's a Super Bowl city.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so we've got that for delays. Fees. Who's faced some unreasonable fees? There we go. The Phil Donahue of the INCOMPAS Show.
We have fees. So Colorado has imposed a one-time fee up front to be in the state right-of-way, and plus an annual per-foot fee that can be raised at whatever rates they decide going forward, so you never know what your O&M is going to be on those fees, as well as then the delays. It takes forever. It could take anywhere from a few weeks to some providers have had some permits sitting there for over a year. So it's hard to do a grant that has a timeline to know that you're going to be able to get it done.
Goodness. Okay, what about in-kind compensation? Who's been asked to create sidewalks during your build? Or who's been asked to repave roads or any of the other in-kind potential contributions? Oh, Kevin has.
You know from yesterday.
I know, but you know, other folks might not. Go ahead. The conduit.
I was going to say I'm loud enough without this, but yeah, I mean, we've been asked by, I'll say, another NFL city to put conduit in the ground, turn it over to the city to own the conduit, and then lease back the conduit that we installed from them for an annual fee. So that's fun.
Yeah. I think it's really important, to sort of set the stage for the discussion that we're trying to have. Now, this isn't a feel-bad exercise. There's going to be a number of opportunities, I think, as our distinguished panel is about to sort of let you all know, to make some real changes and to make some real reforms. So if we could go back to our panelists, I want to introduce them or give them an opportunity to introduce themselves. When we were doing our preparation for this panel, we sort of drew straws on issue areas. And so, I wanted to go to our panelists now, who are some of the best legal minds, working on these issues, and we're really, really thrilled to have them. We've got Danielle Burt back again for the permitting discussion from Morgan Lewis. We've got Rondell Sesto from Cooley. We've got Steve Harrow from Harrow Solutions, Jay Johnson from Venable, and Katie Milner from Hogan Levels. Thank you all so much for being here. So I will start on the left. Danielle, tell us about some of the reforms and thinking that is currently under consideration at NTIA and the FCC.
Sure. I'll start with the FCC first, simply because they have a couple of different proceedings that are going on, the first of which is a NOI, a notice of inquiry, to determine for wireline products whether or not there should be reforms that are similar or go further than some of the things that the FCC has already done to reform wireless small cell deployments. They also have, the FCC and NPRM, on extending some of the wireless small cell reforms to include some of the macro towers. And these proceedings are certainly ones that have a number of touch points. There's going to be comments and reply comments, and if the notice of inquiry at the FCC on wireline goes further, it will also result in another notice of proposed rulemaking, NPRM. So these are things that are happening over the course of the next year. In addition, at NTIA, given that there is BEAD funding that is being distributed hopefully in December, and the deployments that will begin thereafter being on a time clock, we've heard some statements from the administrator that they want to encourage states to help streamline the permitting process and in the BEAD program, as well as looking for ways to try to, again, think about not only do we want to streamline the process from the states and the localities, but also in terms of some of the things that the federal government can help with, whether that's, and there'll be some others here on the panel to talk about, NEPA and some of the National Historic Preservation. All of that is a long way of saying that there's a lot of things going on right now in terms of meeting the moment for changing reform and reforming.
Yeah. Thanks, Danielle. Okay, that's the regulatory. Ron, tell us a little bit about what's going on the Hill. There are a number of legislative proposals, I think, with respect to permitting reform. And the anticipation, at least that we've been talking to members about, is that it's going to be a real focus once the government comes back from shutdown.
Yeah, no, I think that's correct. There's there's approximately 29 bills addressing permitting reform currently. And they run the gamut from shot clocks for localities to act, to conditioning the receipt of federal funds on streamlining permitting processes, to removing duplicative review of NEPA and other historic review. And so also to alleviate notorious bottlenecks like railroad crossings. And so there's a lot of bills addressing different aspects of the permitting process in an effort to streamline and make it more efficient, with the view being that money and time spent for permitting takes away from the actual deployment of networks and getting kind of these advanced networks deployed in an efficient manner.
Steve, you're coming this from a slightly different angle, representing, I think, a lot of energy companies. Talk a little bit about what is going on, I think, in the telecommunications space, can be and should be applied, I think, to energy. And then are there some financial solutions that we'll get into a little bit later, obviously, but that are being considered, I think, for as potential reforms?
Sure, Chris, thanks. And one thing to point out at the beginning is I'm very proud to represent two INCOMPAS members, the Southwestern Power Group and MMR Fiber Solutions. They're two wholly owned subsidiaries of the MMR Group, which is the largest private contractor, electrical private contractor in the country. At the Southwestern Power Group, we are currently working on building transmission lines. And so as I'm with some amazing subject matter experts, but I just want to qualify that a lot of what I'm going to discuss today is going to be around the need for transmission as part of the greater ecosystem when thinking about permitting reform, when thinking about how we do data centers, how we do broadband, how we do fiber. So I wanted to at least put that qualifier there, because on the financial incentives, there exists plenty of financial incentives for companies to do build-outs at this point. You have programs at DOE like GRIP and other programs that will buy energy from generators and so forth and so on. Then you also have investment tax credits. And I'm going to make an argument that when it comes to financial incentives, the tax code, though not frictionless, is probably the least frictionless of all the options that exist for incentivizing generation and use of that. Unfortunately, though so many folks can benefit currently from an investment tax credit, transmission does not. And when you think about transmission and the time it takes from concept to electrification, we're talking decade or more, sometimes an entire generation, and I can tell a case study about it later. So, and this is all private capital, but yet there's no major true incentive in the tax code that others can take advantage of to do so and build out. And so thinking about from a CEO perspective, from a business perspective, time value of money, laying down that type of capital, when we need transmission the way we do you really think it's going to be a smart investment from your capital investors to say, yeah, we want to build this transmission line, we need money, but we don't know if we're going to get electrified for 20 years. But if you know that there's at least an investment tax credit, and what we're talking about is not for every single transmission project, we're talking about major industrial transmission, 150 miles or more, or across 2 states, and that at a 30% credit, that could spur on development and help, because we will talk about permitting reform. I'm glad to, and I have ideas on it, but at the end of the day, permitting reform for transmission will not be enough. You need financial incentives to do it.
Yeah, great. Jay, it seems like you're starting to write the book on defining the contours of NEPA and some of the Historical Preservation Act. You argued recently, in the 7-county infrastructure coalition versus Eagle County, won that case. It's okay. Won that case for the Supreme Court. Tell us a little bit about your work with environmental and historical preservation, and how your clients are seeking to reform some of the traditional thinking around those particular pieces of legislation.
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. I've been working on environmental and historic preservation review for a whole variety of projects for 20 plus years, and up until this past May, the basic story was probably the one you're all familiar with, which is every agency is worried that they're going to get sued and they'll have to go to court and they'll have to explain themselves. So to avoid that problem, they try to do an extra careful review, whether it's under the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, or Section 106 of the Historic Preservation Act. And they're always thinking, well, if we just do a little bit more, then we'll be able to survive any kind of judicial attacks, and everybody will be happy with us. But of course, that never worked out. Every so often there'd be a new lawsuit that would lead to a loss, and then that would just build more and more into the process. So we took one of those losses. We were building a new linear infrastructure project, an oil train in Utah. The lower court told us, well, thanks for your 3,600-page EIS, but that really wasn't good enough. It should have probably studied, what about refineries that are going to process this oil in Louisiana? Yeah, it's 2,000 miles away, but you can still imagine how that might happen, so you should study it. And we took that to the U.S. Supreme Court, as people here may know or may not know, a case called 7 County Infrastructure Coalition against Eagle County. And the U.S. Supreme Court essentially said NEPA is out of control. They use a great analogy. They say a legislative acorn has turned into a judicial oak. And I think what the Supreme Court was doing in 7 County, and what everybody here needs to know, is that they're cutting that tree down. And they're giving agencies and they're giving project proponents an opportunity to reshape the way that NEPA works, just the way that Chris said. And it's an ability to draw manageable lines. It's an ability to get judicial deference when you are sued. And so, yes, there's more permitting reform that can be done legislatively or in rules. But I think there's already a huge opportunity right in front of all of us to take advantage of this Supreme Court decision and start helping agencies reshape the way they're doing environmental and historic review.
Great. And Katie, AI obviously has been a huge topic at the INCOMPAS Show now for a couple of years. It is, I think, more than ever, I think we're looking ahead to how AI-enabled tools might be able to help permitting. What's the status of that? What kind of things can industry sort of look ahead to when it comes to incorporating AI into this permitting concern and issue?
Yeah, thanks. This is a very fascinating use case for AI, and one where I think there's a lot of potential. Because what is AI good at? It can take all different types of data from different sources and use them to formulate predictions about future outcomes. So I think there's tons of opportunity to see how this tool can be leveraged to alleviate some of these pain points that we've already heard about and have been hearing about for years now. I think as an initial matter, my clients, which are telecom providers, fiber companies, investors in those companies, really are wanting to seize this moment to build. We talked about the emergence of the BEAD funding. Those projects are going from spreadsheet to shovel ready at this point. We've heard a lot about the need to continue with 5G, small cell densification, be ready for 6G, but also to support AI. So the time for these reforms that I think everyone has touched on, these elements to be examining for ways to streamline and improve these processes, really is now. But I think where my specific angle on this is to dive more on what AI can be doing that it isn't doing today. And I think there are some very interesting pilot programs going on that are having measurable results already. So one I'd like to touch on is in Pennsylvania, where AI was used in a pilot program directed by the governor there to help streamline regulations. So they tasked an agency with looking at the state regulations and with AI tools, finding out what's duplicative, what doesn't make sense anymore, and also comparing their state's regulations to other states to see where there are gaps or disharmonious outcomes. So I call this, it sounds a little familiar to a Doge type situation, but maybe with more of a scalpel than a chainsaw in a way that was a little more careful. But it was very successful. They had employee buy-ins. The tools, the technology was being used to help agency personnel, state employees, optimize these processes, streamline their workflows. And they had a great result in that they developed, they put all their permitting stuff online, they had a dashboard, and they were able, within 2 weeks after completing this project, to work through 73% of their backlog and stay current. So that's results right there. I also think in terms of using AI for day-to-day permitting tasks. Santa Clara County in Los Angeles, quite populous, I think it's the 7th biggest county in California, has been piloting an AI permitting tool in particular that's putting this information online, that adds transparency, that lets everyone know the current status. They've been using it to identify application completeness at the outset, so you're not submitting an application waiting weeks and weeks to hear back whether something's missing, wrong, not in the format that this particular jurisdiction wants. The AI tool can identify where bottlenecks are likely to pop up and help streamline those processes. And I'm sure that one agency employee that we heard about would love to have this sort of dashboard, or keep the things that can be automated streamlined until you get to the point where human intervention is needed. Just given our current political climate, I don't see a great boom coming in state government funding, in agency hiring. So I think we need to be looking at these technological tools to see how we can bridge the gaps and keep things running smoothly in this kind of new environment.
Well, thank you all. So, wanted to give you all sort of the contours, I think, for the discussion today. But if there are other areas that we wanted to discuss as well, by all means, please feel free to raise your hand, and we can get the discussion headed in that direction. I'm wondering if, with all of that sort of laid down as the foundation, I think, for today's discussion, I'm wondering if you all sort of agree with the first Slido question about some of the obstacles I think that your clients are facing, I think, when it comes to permitting reform, and how is that impacting, how are those obstacles, and how is that impacting your advocacy, I think, to the various agencies that we've discussed, and in the various fora in which you guys work?
I mean, I'm happy to start. I mean, absolutely. I mean, the time clocks, or lack thereof, are grossly prohibitive to progress. The case study that I referred to earlier in my opening remarks, company I proudly represent, they built a transmission line called SunZia. The concept began in 2003. The papers were first polled in 2006. In 2006, it cost $1.5 million per mile to build a transmission line. SunZia is not yet electrified. It will electrify probably later this year. So we are literally a generation from when we pulled those permits, and it is not yet operational. Guess what it costs to build a transmission line today? $4.5 million a mile, from 1.5 in 2006. Now, that's not an inflation. 1.5 now is $2.4 million. That is just the realities of supply chain and other things that occur over 20 years. Now, when you're talking about transmission, which is a private capitally intensive project, how do you plan for that? And then your permitting process continues to slow down. There are too many things that prohibit progress, that allow for too many ways to muck up the system and slow it down. So, given the need, the current process is terribly prohibitive to making sure that we have this key source to this infrastructure. You cannot have generation and end use without transmission. Transmission is the highway that makes it all work. But yet we're not doing anything to speed that up. Or the things that we're doing right now are just kind of trimming around the edges.
Chris, to add on to something Katie said, I mean, I think that sometimes, the delays are happening as a result of, a number of different procedures. Sometimes there are some things happening on the front end where you need certain engineering, or you have, some companies that you're working with for deployment. But you also still have to work through whatever the locality or state regulators are, and they may have RFP processes, or one person, to Alan's point, working for them. You have a number of moving targets, and so all of that compounds the problem, and maybe there are some ways to reform that with some other tools, but for now, I think that the timing is terribly difficult to plan for, and that's necessary when you have a BEAD timeline or some other general deployment goals.
Yeah, I would just add that even where you do have time clocks, like if you're installing small cells and there is a time clock that's applicable, localities can still kind of play games with that, right? They can wait till the end of the period, deny it, make you go through it again. So it's not necessarily just having a time clock in and of itself doesn't solve the issue. It certainly would be better than having nothing, but there needs to be even reform of how time clocks are enforced, because it's very easy to game and even stretch out that situation even when there are time clocks.
Yeah, another pain point I've heard too is access to public rights of way, even if the ground's already been disturbed at some point earlier, that going back and laying more fiber, there's still a lot of hoops to jump through, and there's a lack of transparency, predictability, and timeliness to those reviews.
Yeah, I mean, I think what this illustrates, every single person up here has a different answer, and I would say the same, from the environmental review perspective. And it's part of the problem is integrating all these pieces together, both at the government level, whether it's state, local, federal, whatever it is, and on the applicant side. You have to have all your ducks in a row when you go in before you can even start moving through these processes. So it's a complicated process.
And then just to add on, and you have to be adaptable. I mean, sometimes there are changes as a result of it takes a decade to electrify.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I want to get back to the cross-collaboration between agencies here in a little bit, but let me focus for just a couple minutes, if you all don't mind, on the FCC's permitting NOI. This is a big point of interest, I think, for Encompass members. We've spent some time at this show talking a little bit about how we are going to respond to what the Commission is proposing. But I'm curious, what's the status of that permitting proceeding? What is the Commission specifically proposing? What's the basis upon which it's suggesting that it can take some steps under 253 the same way that it did under 332 in the wireless context?
So the status is that they have voted the notice of inquiry, and there will be comments taken in November and December, assuming, again, there aren't delays for a request by parties. And the questions surround, things that you have seen heard from this panel up here and have seen in a number of contexts. Should there be shot clocks? Should there be a determination about safe harbors on fees? Should there be a reasonable cost associated with fees of any kind, whether that's the upfront fee, the linear foot, or other kind of gross revenue fees, the other in-kind contributions that folks have seen? There are questions associated with, how can we help in other ways to streamline, whether that happens to be trying to avoid duplicative processes, not just from the states, but between the states and the feds, and that may mean with DOE or with NEPA or across a number of, they have a lot of questions intentionally because they want to hear from everyone who may be impacted by this in order to create a record that allows them to come up with specific proposals. And I think at the end of the day, to your final point of your question, Chris, they are looking at, the ways in which they can take what they did in the small cell NPRM to create some shot clocks and to create some reasonable cost standards, safe harbors and the like, and apply them to the extent possible in the wireline context. And there are some questions associated with whether or not all of those things are possible under 253 as compared to 332, but there's certainly going to be folks putting forth arguments to express, why there are opportunities to make changes in the wireline space.
I guess I'm curious, what's your best thinking, I think, on whether or not the Commission is going to ultimately have that kind of authority? How are we, how as Encompass, as an industry, can we get the Commission, to a point where, it believes, it's going to propose a theory that's going to survive judicial scrutiny, that's going to allow it, I think, to put forward some of these proposals, whether it's shot clocks or whether it's, the elimination of or fees that it can find reasonable under the statute. Anyone have any thinking on that?
I would just say, predicting judicial success is always,
Fool's errand?
Troublesome. But I also think with Loper Bright too, we're in a different kind of context where courts now have more authority to overrule the FCC and their agency action on a case-by-case basis. You have to see what happens with that. But I think the small cell order is actually a pretty good blueprint. The 2018 small cell order that was upheld by the Ninth Circuit, where certain rules were found to be within the agency's purview and based on statute. So certain rules like the shot clock, the fee caps, things like that. I think one important factor there, though, in the judicial review was the facts that the agency developed in support of its rules. And so I think with respect to this new proceeding, having specific facts will be very important, because that's much more difficult for a court to overlook or to overturn if the agency has done a lot of factual analysis and talks about how they're connecting the statute to the problem, to the rule. It is incredibly important. So developing a factual record of these problems and specific concrete examples will go a long way to both getting the reforms that you want, but also having those rules survive judicial scrutiny, or have the best chance to survive judicial scrutiny.
Yeah. I mean,
Jay, Katie?
I think that's where Encompass can be helpful to the agency. Ron's exactly right. With low per byte, courts are going to feel less deferential toward whatever rule that an agency puts out. But if you have an industry group coming in and with facts, absolutely, but also even with legal arguments, because agencies aren't always 100% clear on their legal reasoning when they put out rules. You can help them with that at the rulemaking stage, and you can help them with that in court. And I think that's going to be essential going forward with low per byte as the new rule.
And trying to predict the FCC's likelihood of action, I think they do have an appetite to adopt some of these reforms. FCC Chairman Carr was Commissioner Carr in the 2018 small cells order. And I think he was very proud of the reforms there. He took that up as one of his key issues, part of his legacy in streamlining the deployment there. So I do think this is a bipartisan issue in many ways, in that it's going to lead to benefits to consumers, greater expansion of broadband, U.S. leadership in key technologies. So I think once the FCC is up to full functioning again, that they will move forward. As Danielle noted, the wireline item is at the NOI stage, so it would take another cycle of the FCC issuing a notice of proposed rulemaking, so that's going to delay adoption of ultimate rules, whereas the wireless item is a notice of proposed rulemaking now, so they can move forward with a report and order, so that they may be on different tracks timing-wise.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I mean, one of the things I think that Encompass is hopeful, I think, that given where Chairman Carr was as a commissioner putting the 2018 small cell order through, leads us to believe that he sees, as part of his Build America agenda, that it's going to be possible to push forward some of these very similar type reforms. Your other point is well taken as well. This is an NOI, which means we've got at least one more stage to get through, so long as there's not further notices and things along those lines. I hate to try to pin anyone down, but prognosticate a little bit for me. In 2026, do we get the NPRM? If the evidence and the record is strong in terms of reform, do we get the NPRM in 2026? Danielle, what do you think? No one's going to hold you to this. It's only recorded.
I think it is something that they're aiming to do. I think that's the aspiration. I think the question is going to be a bit about how they're managing all the things that they're aspiring to do. There are an awful lot of things that are currently on Chairman Carr's agenda, and I also think that while we're currently waiting for the government to reopen, that definitely impacts their ability, because they don't have as many staff there, and hopefully we wouldn't run into more trouble with budget functions as the year goes on, but it's just a question right now. So it's an aspiration. I'm not sure if it will come to fruition.
Fair. Ron, what do you think?
I think they'll get it done. I agree with Danielle. I mean, there's certainly a lot of obstacles, and I hate to be so definitive, but I would be surprised if they don't release the NPRM in 2026 at some point. I mean, it could even, I was going to say it could even be second quarter, but that might even be a bit aggressive. But that could happen.
Yeah. Steve, what do you think?
I guess I would say, Chris, that though it may feel on a certain day that we have to deal with every single regulatory agency to build a transmission line in the federal government, the FCC actually is not one of them yet. So I think I'm very blessed to be in the middle of these 4 subject matter experts on predicting that. We could talk about other predictions throughout the panel, but that's not me.
All right, Jay, what about you? What do you think?
I mean, I probably don't really know enough to predict this, but I'll at least say what I do know, which is I guess I'm a little more on the pessimistic side about everything that's happening right now. This shutdown, I don't think we realize how far the shutdown set people back right now.
That's fair.
I mean, it's a full month plus with basically nothing happening.
Yeah.
And when people come back, they're going to have a lot of catching up to do. And so 2026, the end of 2026 feels like a long way away, so I'm not saying it's impossible, but if there are any more problems, as Danielle suggested, another shutdown or, more lost personnel, I think you're going to have big problems.
Yeah. So on that point then that I can comment on, because I think you're absolutely right, Jay. The backlog at the FCC, because I do some work with other clients with the FCC, the backlog there beyond our issues is pretty substantial around media, broadcasting, other stuff like that. And so I do think the shutdown, however long it lasts, I mean, a shutdown's not linear. We're at 35 days. That does not mean that when you turn the government back, if we turn the government back on tonight, that does not mean that they're only 35 days behind. Mm-hmm. Right? I don't know what that factorial is in terms of how far you're behind at this point, but you're more than 35 days behind in terms of getting back going. So I think that's a very astute observation that for reasons that have nothing to do with the policy, it could be delayed further than how we crystal ball it.
Yeah. Katie, I'll let you weigh in.
Yeah, I'll be an optimist on that. Reflecting on my co-panelist remarks here, though, I think the FCC post-Loper Bright is also going to be careful to review the record very carefully. It's going to be incumbent on the affected parties to make sure the FCC has the data it needs to support their decisions. So that could add some extra time, but I remain optimistic.
Okay. Wanted to turn back to the Hill, which was the second point that we were bringing up. We're joined by Caroline Olson, that does a lot of our legislative work at INCOMPAS. She has been working very hard on a railroad crossing bill that I think we're hoping to get introduced sometime soon. But as Ron was saying, there is a legislative package of, 29 bills, something along those lines?
29 bills,
29 bills. Going down the panel, are there particular bills in there that your clients support, that we need to be paying particularly close attention to because they seem to have a lot of congressional support? I know, as Ron said, Congressman Hudson really wants to sort of get this going and make this sort of the thrust of the Commerce Committee's agenda, I think, throughout the fall. But, Jay, why don't we start with you? Are there any environmental reform bills in there that have caught your attention?
Well, the biggest one that I know about is, I think, what they call the SPEED Act in the House. It's essentially, as it currently exists, I think it sort of codifies a lot of what the Supreme Court did in 7 County.
Okay.
Based on conversations, I think the Senate is going to make a lot of changes to that, or at least propose a lot of changes. I think there is bipartisan support for doing something to make environmental review and permitting go faster. Unclear whether you need to codify 7 County, which is already the law, or whether there are other things you can add in and maybe trade off some of those 7 County codifications and get some other things. So I think there could be a lot of appetite for environmental review and permitting reform in both houses of Congress and in both parties in the new year.
Katie, how about you?
Well, one thing I've been mulling over in terms of creative solutions that I'd like to see would be borrowed from the Semiconductor and Chips Act. First, Congress passed that act, and then they followed up to say that companies receiving funding over that app would get expedited permitting and not be subject to NEPA reviews. And I think if we do have consensus that building broadband networks, supporting data centers, that this is a national priority, that this is of critical interest, that there are overwhelming reasons to make these things happen quickly, I would love to see some sort of congressional action on that. to say, yes, we too prioritize this, and we're going to remove the burdens, the pain points that are within our ability to do for this certain sector, for this time frame, whatever it needs to be, however that needs to be cabined. But I think that could make a real difference, in the next, say, a 5-year period, and really getting some of these construction projects moving.
Danielle?
Well, I know you said other than railroad, but I have to say it's railroad.
You can talk, yes, by all means, we love talking railroads, and I would love for you to talk about railroads so that Caroline does not have to.
Honestly, that is one of the things we hear from clients all the time is the difficulty in getting their attention and then keeping their attention depending upon the particulars. And moreover, it's something that's costly, and it's not just costly in the first instance, but it's costly if you change title in the second and third. So I think that that's the most focused reform that everyone is talking about with our clients.
And to that point, sorry. No. She said railroads, so I might as well. To that point, you all know Encompass has been the tip of the spear with the railroad legislation, but right now it is getting held up a little bit, just inner workings of politics. So if you or your lobbyists want to express your frustrations with railroads and why this legislation is so important, I think nudging the committee to work on this is going to be critical, because when they get back in, Hudson is going to take this up immediately, and if our bill isn't dropped, we're going to miss the boat. So any pressure, anyone can apply. We're going to be applying a ton, but I welcome yours as well. That was my plug.
Well, I'm happy to have given that, so I will let Ron go.
Ron?
So I think there's a number of interesting bills. I think the Wireless Leadership Act, which would codify what the small cell bill did, is important, particularly in light of Loper Bright. So now you have a law that enshrines it that would get rid of any ambiguity. The BEAD Fee Act, which is imperfect in many ways, but would condition and incentivize BEAD recipients to, if they streamline, they would withhold federal funds unless they streamline their permitting process. And then there's the Digital Applications Act, which would require the Forestry Service and the the Forestry Service and the Department of the Interior to create an online portal for permitting needs. And so a lot of that permitting process is, the Government Accountability Office did a study, and it was taking over 270 days for those two agencies to process permits. So having a portal where you could submit it, not have to submit paper applications, then have accountability in the fact that that's tracking, I think is a pretty innovative idea to resolve that issue, or those issues.
Steve, how about the energy sector? Anything that you're tracking amongst those 29 bills?
Yeah, obviously not tracking all 29 bills, because that's just, that's not necessarily, you're tracking the concepts, and you're tracking, the politics of the possible. So though, we're never going to come out and say specifically like what bill we endorse, and I go back to my original premise, permitting reform for us as transmission builders is not enough. It's not a panacea. So we will look to support bills that incentivize the construction of transmission, but we support permitting reform around the concepts that will speed things up, like statutory deadlines and concurrent reviews, consolidated comment periods, reduced reopening reviews, and then other tactics that are used to kind of delay to destroy, putting a statute of limitation on legal challenges, expedited judicial review, requiring people who bring suit to show harm. Again, because that just further delays, sometimes years, the process. So if we get to a point, and we can talk about the politics of the possible, of how we do this, given the current climate, those would be the concepts that I think you're seeing, not just my clients, but other folks in this space are looking to see happen.
I want to go back to the idea of cross-agency collaboration, just real quickly, and then we can put a bow, I think, on our discussion of federal and regulatory and legislative potential reforms. What is, theoretically, the administration has 3.5 years left to sort of get some of these reforms done if it wants to become, if it wants to streamline permitting in a way that allows for one-stop shopping and duplicative reviews. What do you sort of see as the potential for greater interagency collaboration in the permitting world? Danielle?
That there are more conversations happening right now. As a result of that, you're seeing more information about ways in which to process not just that information to make reform, but also to collaborate. Somebody who's found something that works in the industry likes to share those successes so that they can build on them. And I think that's what we're going to see, is more conversation to create an opportunity for everyone in these different agencies to build on each other.
Anyone else?
I would add one thing, maybe a couple of things. One, the White House is certainly very interested in this issue. So if you have something, especially something big and energy related that you want to build, there are people in the White House who are going to listen, and they're going to call agencies and get herd the cats, so to speak, I guess I would say. How that plays out over the next 5 years or 10 years, that's a more sort of systemic problem that we have to figure out. You're not always going to have an administration that's going to push really hard, and that's okay. You just have to find a way to work with the people you have in front of you, and that's why you need legislative reform. That's why you need rules reform, so that the default is for agencies to work together.
Yeah, I see benefits here, but maybe a few words of warning to the extent it can ameliorate duplicative reviews, maybe a memorandum of understanding between interested agencies to kind of set forth the process, how often they'll be meeting, what they'll be collaborating on, setting the rules of the road. But I guess what I would fear there is if this ends up in more bureaucracy or red tape or mission creep. Steve mentioned he doesn't deal with the FCC now. I would hate for him to have to start dealing with them as a result of interagency collaboration. Yeah. So that would have to be navigated, but I do think best practices and information sharing is generally a positive.
One thing too, I think under the Mobile Now Act, the General Services Administration created a uniform form for putting wireless facilities on federal buildings. And it's not used by every federal agency yet, but the FCC is advocating for more and more use of that. And that's also some interagency use there that would streamline that kind of review and allow for the siting of wireless facilities in a much more efficient process.
Forgive me, I want to put one more question in here. I really liked this one. This is one that Stacy wanted to make sure we got in here. Should data centers, edge computing, and fiber backhaul be federally classified as critical infrastructure? And what would that classification change?
Well, I guess that's the operative question, right? Like, what would be the purpose of that? And the answer most likely is that if you're, and in some sense, it already is, right? Like, telecommunication infrastructure is already critical infrastructure. So to the extent that fiber or things like that leading to data centers, that's already falls under that rubric. Actually, there's an energy component to it in the sense that if you're labeled as critical infrastructure and when there's some sort of disaster or anything like that, you get prioritization in terms of being repowered up. And so there's some benefit there. I think, though, that there's also some obligations that come with that that you'd have to balance. Like, you might have to harden those networks in a way that you didn't think of before. Although, in a lot of cases, providers are already doing that. So there's probably some upside associated with it. I don't know all the puts and takes, though, to say, oh, it's definitively a great idea to do. In many cases, like when you talk about hyperscalers or other people that are co-located in those facilities, they have pretty stringent SLAs for being on time and getting backups in place. And certainly there's some force majeure exceptions to that, but they're typically, data center operators are typically properly incentivized and highly motivated to get those facilities up and running, and they have diesel backup and all these other things. So I'm not really sure how much you gain by a critical infrastructure designation, but I'm sure it requires a little bit more study.
Yeah.
I guess I would also say, not that I'm against the concept, but I don't believe it was mentioned in the White House's AI action plan in terms of that being necessary, yeah. One. But two, and this is no knock on data centers, but of all the projects that you think about, when you think about permitting reform and slowness to market, I don't think data centers have as huge a problem of standing up over a critical amount of time as other projects do in the ecosystem, be it generation projects or transmission lines. And so, again, I'm going to repeat myself. You're going to get tired of me, but what you're not going to say is that I'm not on message. So, yes, great, but let's think about what also data centers need and making sure that they also fall under critical infrastructure as well, and that helps with their process to get to market quicker.
Anyone else?
I think it's also a national security component. You know, once you get to the designation of critical infrastructure, as Ron mentioned with telecommunications, you know, there's this other layer of regulation that applies, and, you know, sometimes that actually can slow things down as compared to speed it up.
It's a nice counterbalance, I think, you know, with the question. Okay, Steve, we talked a little bit earlier about some of the financial incentives. I want to talk about that. I want to make sure we get through to talk a little bit more about some of the AI-enabled tools that everyone is sort of seeing start to make their way into the marketplace that will hopefully be helping some of the local jurisdictions. But you were talking a little bit about some financial models that, you know, you think could sort of help modernize the permitting process, and then ways, I think, to sort of maybe some tax incentives, things along those lines that you think could be used to, when there's an anticipation of more complex permitting that might take time, would ease the burden, I think, on some of the providers.
Yeah, I mean, the financing models that I was thinking about or discussing, it doesn't actually help the permitting process, but it eases the burden of the permitter that's going through that process to make sure that they have they can seek out the capital, and they have the patience to withstand the timing of what they have to work through, right? So if, you know, like an investment tax credit, plenty of companies can currently benefit from an investment tax credit of 30%, so long as they hit certain metrics. And so thinking about permitting reform, it's unlikely to be a tax bill, but do you look at the tax system to complement permitting reform? Again, I use the word frictionless. Of all the options that are out there, because you have the LPO, the Loan Program Office at DOE, you have other programs at DOE that actually give money, or they'll buy your power, or do things like that. There's a lot of friction there in the way that the tax system isn't as much. And though all policy is politics, it's a lot easier to make a decision about a grant or a loan that's subjective than it is to make an interpretation of tax policy. And that subjective decision at the Loan Programming Office can happen a lot more often than when we actually pass tax laws. I mean, you think about major overhauls to the tax system by which the ITC, came in 2021. You really have only had 5 major tax overhauls since 1986. Mm-hmm. So that's why I kind of use the word frictionless, because if it's in the code, then it's more incentivized for companies to invest the money knowing that they're going to have to put that long-term capital away for many, many years, even if you have permitting reform. Like my 20-year example of SunZia, if permitting reform's in place, that 20 years is maybe then 13, if we're being candid, mm-hmm. right? That's still a long, tough putt when you're trying to attract private capital, if you have absolutely zero incentive at the federal government.
Yeah. Anyone else, any thoughts about financing models or incentives I think that could be put in place to resolve some of these issues? That's okay. The one other thing, when it comes to potentially performance-based encouragement, I think you could say, is NTIA has recently sort of announced that of the $42.5 billion that is going to go into the BEAD fund, only about 19 is currently sort of up for consideration as part of sort of initial state plans and state models for the BEAD program, leaving a considerable amount in potential non-deployment funding and levers that NTIA Administrator Ariel Roth can pull to potentially assist with and modernize the permitting infrastructure, the permitting process. What is your expectation for how she is going to use the non-deployment funds, and will she use that as a lever to try to make states improve their process?
Well, I mean, I guess the hope would be that that would be the case. I think that there's probably competing incentives there, though, right? I mean, I think that if there are substantial savings in the BEAD state programs, I think that there could be some political pressure to return those funds, right? I mean, I think you would look pretty good to the administration if you say, hey, we had this $42.5 billion fund by the prior administration and we squeezed $19 billion out of it and we're giving that back to the federal government. That's a powerful message, at least from the administration's perspective, rather than saying, okay, we're going to let the states decide what to do with that $19 billion. Improve permitting, whatever it is they might do. I guess the wild card there is that a lot of state senators are kind of getting into the scrum and they don't want to see that money go away from their state. So you have to see what happens with that. But I think that probably net, there's probably more political points in returning that to the federal government than allowing states just to kind of do what they want with that money, I would guess. Yeah.
But maybe there'll be an opportunity to try to redeploy that money for mid-mile deployment,
maybe.
For example.
Yeah.
There wasn't as much money associated with the mid-mile as there was for the home connection, so that might be another opportunity for the states to keep it.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a way to split the baby on that, because to call BEAD a success at the end of the day, it's going to be about homes covered, people connected. They're going to want good stats on that. But if they could do it at a discounted price, even better. So I wonder if there's a way to do a win-win there. Use less of the money, use it more effectively, get the numbers you want at the end of the day to justify the program's existence. But I love thinking about the creative solutions as you put them forward here, Chris, of what the levers could be. I think there is room to prod states, since they are receiving this money, carrots and sticks that can be used to make sure that these programs are able to hit the ground running.
Yeah. Jay, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a whole lot to add, but I mean, I agree that being able to come up with these creative solutions there's no doubt the administration is going to want as much money back as possible. I think that's like a given. So I think what Katie said is right on target. If you can find a way to say, hey, we got money back, but we also made the program work, like that's the win-win.
Yeah, we had a meeting, we had a meeting with Administrator Roth, and we got that impression that she was very interested in returning, as much of that funding, I think, to the administration as possible, but which made it more curious when a couple of weeks after our meeting, she indicated that they could potentially use some of that non-deployment dollars for permitting. So we'll have to wait and see, and that'll be interesting to sort of follow that. I want to turn in our last 10 minutes to AI, and I'm very curious, your clients, what is their expectation for how AI-enabled tools and technologies can be incorporated into some of these processes, both within their own companies, but then also at the local level, and how can we harness the power of AI, I think, to make this and facilitate this process?
Yeah, happy to kick that off if that's all right. My clients love AI. We love talking about AI. They love issuing press releases about AI. But it does hold a lot of promise, both for their own processes, their own network planning. There was a panel earlier today about the use of AI for cybersecurity purposes. There's very promising use cases in terms of anticipating future growth, consumer usage, where to harden your networks, where's more storm likely, harnessing all that data to really more smartly use your investments to make the strongest possible network, deliver the best customer experience. On the local permitting side, I see a lot of opportunity. I think it's pretty nascent still, apart from these pilot programs that are going on. I think there are some companies that are trying to sell solutions. They'll have their own sort of bridges to cross in terms of demonstrating the efficacy, how much time is really saved, how much money is needed to outlay on the AI service versus human time power. But just observing from the outside, I think permitting is a very fertile ground to be employing these solutions when we're talking about easy checks, comparing against prior applications that have passed to say this is 98% like one we granted last year, this should be an easy one. Those types of initial reviews seem really readily accessible for a machine to handle. So I think it's going to be up to the AI developers to really prove their concepts, to figure out what prices they can do them at, to make sure they have the security, integrity of the data, addressing those concerns, the internal governance concerns such that we can trust our municipal governments to use them. So optimistic, but I think we're still early is how I'll end it there.
Yeah, Katie, talk a little bit just about the software that you're seeing, not the software, I mean, just the AI tools themselves. I mean, what kinds of factors are they using, I think, in order to sort of make some of the decisions that couldn't be relied on by local governments?
Right, so they are able to comb through the historical data. I think AI tools are very good too at doing an initial scan, maybe doing a summary, the way perhaps an application would have been submitted and a utility commission staff member would have written a summary memo for the commissioners about what's in it. AI can spit that out in a matter of seconds to say, geography, dimensions, these things in a readily accessible format. And what I wouldn't want to see is it completely replacing the human oversight. These are important decisions, everything. There's nuances in what we do. We can't all be entirely replaced by a computer. But I think there's promise in the AI software doing those initial steps, gauging for completeness, that we talked about situations where an application is submitted and you don't hear back for several weeks about whether it's complete or whether there's an element that should have been addressed that wasn't. Cutting down those times in order to make things happen more smoothly, more quickly. But yeah, drawing on historical data. And I really like the idea of AI looking to see what other jurisdictions are doing and saying, our timelines are 90 days, the next county over is 30, and this is working better for them in XYZ ways. I think that would be really compelling and increase more buy-in for making reforms that benefit both the builders and the localities.
So one real-world example, though, is Utah has implemented an AI tool where when you submit your application, it determines whether the route you've submitted would go over environmentally sensitive or archaeologically sensitive sites. And if it doesn't, you get an interim permit to proceed while they do a more further review. And I think that's a really excellent implementation where if you can kind of figure out what the hotspots are, evaluate the application, have interim approval to move forward, that's pretty good.
I mean, Jay, are you finding the AI tools that do some of that work? I mean, accurate and with respect to
actually responding, but you first have to read them all and categorize them all. If AI could read all those comments and just put them into categories, I think that would be, you could save months on a typical review. Yeah. But I don't know, I mean,
it can do that, yeah, it can do that now. You're always dealing with the nuance of the accuracy. Like we've piloted some things about, summarize this docket, summarize this comment, and maybe it'll rephrase something in a way that's not quite right or make an assumption that isn't always right. So it definitely is not a replacement for a seasoned lawyer or a consultant who has been through several rounds on the same proceeding to understand it.
You'd need someone who was familiar with the issues to start with, get the summary and say, something's wrong with this issue. Why did somebody say this? And then you go back and check it, I guess. I mean, 'cause you could easily take more time if you're not careful.
Yeah, I think you could probably rely on the AI to say, who's for or against, what are the main arguments for, what are the main arguments against, and then have your experienced people with the right background and context read the actual comments and understand more what the arguments are. So yeah, definitely not a replacement, but hopefully aid.
Yeah. Danielle or Steve, any thoughts on some of these tools?
I just think, again, it's not just then seeing how the tools are adapting to a particular item, but it is the sharing of information. As that county, and Katie's example, that's going 90 days versus the county that's going 30, you start to share information about, well, how are you inputting your information? Are we using the same platforms so that hopefully there is again, best practices sharing.
Yeah. We're coming to the end of our panel. If I could have our second Slido question come up. All right, okay. Other, 75%. Okay, great. Okay, the question is, what reform, because I am about to limit our panelists to a single permitting reform that they could suggest. If you could suggest one permitting reform that would most effectively accelerate broadband deployment, what would it be? Reasonable fee guidance, adoption of AI-enabled permitting tools, cross-agency collaboration, or streamlining environmental and/or historical review. Looks like streamlining has environmental and historical review has jumped right to the top. Who has other?
What is that?
I think that top one is supposed to be like a shot clock or something.
Is that shot clock? Oh, there's just so much there. Okay, so shot clocks, yes.
Really see it.
Streamlining environmental and historical review second, and other. Who's got other? Someone outside this room is involved. Okay, if you all could give one permitting reform suggestion to Brendan Carr, to Ariel Roth, to Congressman Hudson, I'm curious, what would it be? Danielle.
I don't think that it's the same one for each of those, but I think for...
Drop out, come on.
No, I'm going to give an answer. I think it's the same answer for each one because I think they're approaching this differently. But I think for Carr, it's basically the fees situation because I think that he can utilize what they did in the small cell decision to create a reasonable cost situation. I think for Administrator Roth, I think it's looking at how do we incentivize to streamline because that is something with BEAD right now that is going to be ever important with the timeline. And I think for our congressional delegation, it's going to be, how can we utilize our federal government to push down to the states and localities some of the things that we have the tools to do.
Yeah. Ron.
I guess I'll do the same then. For a congressional solution, I think adding deemed granted as a kind of an enforcement mechanism, and I think really that probably does require Congress. I'm not really sure an agency could do that. But so I think a deemed granted standard for enforcement of shot clocks and permitting would be pretty good. On the FCC side, I think that that maybe, I think the best thing the FCC could probably do is coordinate, come up with some sort of way to coordinate with the tribal lands and the federal lands on the historic and environmental review to make that kind of one-stop shopping. So there'd be one agency in charge, like maybe where it's first filed or whatever, does the review, and the rest are kind of follow-on rather than independent reviews of those applications. And so just to kind of get rid of this this kind of iterative review of those applications. And then at the NTIA, I think it is all about BEAD. I think if they could adopt some proposals that would incentivize the recipients of BEAD grants to streamline their permitting process, that would be a pretty good thing.
Yeah, Steve. Yeah, you don't have to do FCC and Congressman.
I have no intent.
If you want to do DOE, FERC, you let me know.
I have no intention to, although Ron is telling me I need to. I'm definitely a permitting shot clock guy. That brings certainty for private capital investment and for actually making a reasonable budgeting process for your project.
Yeah. Jay, it's interesting. NEPA, has, federal rules, obviously, right? But that are sort of developed, across agencies, and they've been pared so significantly back to the statutory language. I don't want you to feel compelled to have to talk to Brendan Carr or any of the others. When it comes to NEPA and NEPA reforms, what would you suggest, and who would you suggest it to?
So I think with NEPA, there's going to continue to be lawsuits. The Sierra Club's not going to give up trying to stop projects it doesn't like. I think the best way to deal with those in light of 7 County is we now know that agencies are allowed to draw manageable lines. So what I would suggest to every agency is at the front end of your process, meet with the applicant, figure out what you're going to study and why, and then explain it. If you can figure out the scope of your study and explain why this is in and this is out, you should be able to survive judicial review. So I think that's the biggest progress point on a NEPA review at this stage.
Great. And Katie?
I agree with the shot clocks, and I see the audience does too, but to tack on as well, greater investment and encouragement of technological solutions. I think it's pretty appalling that we're talking about filing applications on paper in 2025. So we could start there with PDF submissions. But in general, encouraging these pilot programs, giving states the money they need. I don't think, as I said, the workforce is not coming back, so we need to find out ways to leverage technology to make sure that these build-outs are not delayed.
So we've talked a long time. I want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to ask some questions. I know we are a few minutes over. We've reclaimed the time that Stacy took from us. But are there questions for our panelists before we let these folks go and enjoy the closing party?
Not Stacy.
Yes.
Go ahead.
I'm going to take more time.
You're entitled. You're the boss.
Why didn't any of you say guidance on reasonable fees?
I did.
Oh, you
Well, I
did.
basically said I think that the FCC should be looking at reasonable costs, just like they did in the 332,
Thank you, Danielle.
I didn't
Okay.
say because she said it.
and that's
She
it.
said it. Okay, thanks, Danielle.
You're
I appreciate
welcome.
that. That's my question.
So I have a question on the timeliness, especially regarding like State Department of Transportation. Have you seen any timelines on that of how quick they should be required to turn that around? And the second, this is a two-part question. The state I live in is claiming that all of the states are now charging fees if you put fiber in the right-of-way, or most of them are. Have you seen that to be true? Because we're not finding that to be accurate, but that's what the Department of Transportation is telling the legislature, the state legislature.
I guess it depends on what you mean by fee. Do you mean like a per lineal foot fee? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, per foot, per year.
Yeah, no, that's not true. The states have a variety of ways of kind of extracting money from you. I don't, and it's not all per lineal fee. The more reasonable ones are cost-based. It's not like you can do it for nothing. And there are reasonable costs that should be recouped from people that install facilities in the rights of way. I think the problematic ones are when they're just kind of arbitrary, like based on revenue or based on per lineal foot, and certainly not every state's doing that.
Have you seen any timelines for shot clocks?
Well, the ones that we tend to focus on are the ones in the small cell order, which are 60 days for if you're attaching to an existing structure and 90 days for a new one. And that kind of is what we use as kind of a rubric. I don't, that might even be long though for certain kind of installations.
Mm-hmm. Other questions for our panelists? Going once? Mm-hmm. John?
Not a question, but a little bit of a comment relative to the FCC agency. And FCC does a really good job with regard to coordinating projects and putting them on a dashboard and holding the agency to certain timeframes. And so if you have multiple federal agencies, they have to meet these timelines, and or if they don't, they have to explain why, and the applicant has the opportunity to argue and resolve these at high levels within the government. But I think FCC's next move is to start to work with state and local state agencies and trying to get some MOUs with states so that if you have a project that deals with one state agency or a bunch of state agencies, FCC can put that on a dashboard. The state would probably have to do it similar to what they've got with their federal agencies, that they have to meet that deadline, and if they don't, they have to explain why, and then the applicant has the opportunity to critique and disagree, and then it gets resolved pretty quickly because you've got high levels of people that receive the the agency comments and so forth, right? So it all seems to work if they were to expand a little bit, and I wonder if you guys care about that.
No, I think that's I think transparency adds a lot to the process and making people accountable, and certainly that kind of almost shaming, right, has a powerful effect. I think also that would, in terms of what BEAD could do, right, say you must participate in this process, or maybe you get funds given back to you that they would otherwise take if you would implement something like that. I think all those are very good ideas. Anything that I think shines a light on what is an opaque process would be very helpful.
But I'll add to that, I think while maybe as you're thinking about moving from federal to state, that is an opportunity, I think, to something Katie said. I mean, localities are still doing paper. So it's a lot harder to track a system that isn't built for tracking.
Yeah, but if the incentive is that if the BEAD funds are conditioned, or if you get additional funds if you participate in something and that requires you to modernize, even better, right?
Absolutely.
I think it's, and it goes kind of like what your point about taxes, right? I mean, I think if you have these incentives, which tax law, really that's what tax law is, right? It's an incentive to do a certain behavior. If you do it in the terms of federal grants, I think it's actually a powerful motivator, absolutely. And it's also, it's important to governors, and it has, like you were saying, it raises the profile of these issues.
But can they do all of those things in the BEAD timeline? And that's a question that is...
They're going to have to if they want the money, baby.
Love that.
Fair enough. One of the nice things about being able to go last is that you can just stretch a little bit if you want to. I will let you all know that you haven't missed the happy hour. It starts in about 3 or 4 minutes over, I think, in that room. So we haven't missed anything. We've just gotten additional material out of everybody. Like I said, there's a happy hour from 4 to 5 next door on the show floor, and then you've made it all this way, so you might as well come to the closing reception this evening in the veranda room at the Marriott, 6 o'clock. Motowns and mojitos. But before you do that, please join me in giving our panelists a very warm round of applause.